In the deepest corners of criminal history lie names that never made it to the front pages, killers whose brutality matched or even exceeded the most infamous serial murderers we all know. These are the forgotten monsters, the ones who slipped through the cracks of public memory despite leaving trails of unimaginable horror. Today, we're diving into the twisted minds of 5 serial killers you've probably never heard of, but whose crimes will haunt you long after this video ends. Charles Ray Hatcher was a predator who wore the mask of mental illness to escape justice for decades. Born on July 16, 1929, in the small town of Mound City, Missouri, Hatcher's childhood was a blueprint for creating a monster. His father was an abusive, alcoholic ex-convict who ruled the household with violence and fear. When Charles was just 7 years old, he watched his older brother Arthur die in a horrific electrocution accident involving a copper wire. The image of his brother's lifeless body would burn itself into young Charles's mind, planting the first seeds of his obsession with death. At school, the cycle of violence continued. Hatcher was relentlessly bullied by his classmates, but instead of withdrawing, he learned to inflict that same pain on others. He became known for his cruel treatment of smaller children and his disturbing fascination with hurting animals. Teachers dismissed him as a troubled child who would eventually grow out of his behavioral problems. They were catastrophically wrong. By 1947, at just 18 years old, Hatcher had already begun his criminal career with a string of minor offenses. But these weren't random acts of rebellion. They were practice runs for something far more sinister. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he bounced in and out of mental institutions and prisons, always managing to convince psychiatrists that he was more sick than dangerous. This would become his signature move, his get-out-of-jail-free card that he played with chilling effectiveness. Hatcher's killing spree officially began in 1969, though investigators believe his first murder may have occurred years earlier. His method was as cowardly as it was brutal. He targeted the most vulnerable members of society, young boys, teenagers, and men who wouldn't be missed quickly. He would lure them with promises of work, drugs, or simply a ride to wherever they needed to go. Once he had them isolated, Hatcher would reveal his true nature. His first confirmed victim was 12-year-old William Freeman in Antioch, California. On August 5, 1969, just one day before Hatcher was scheduled to face child molestation charges in San Francisco, he abducted the boy from a local park. Freeman's body was found 3 days later in a remote area, strangled with such force that his neck had been nearly crushed. The timing wasn't coincidental. Hatcher was eliminating potential witnesses and satisfying his bloodlust simultaneously. What made Hatcher particularly dangerous was his ability to move freely across state lines. In an era before sophisticated computer databases and instant communication between law enforcement agencies, he exploited the gaps in the system. He would commit a murder in Missouri, flee to Illinois, then pop up in California weeks later. Each time he was arrested, he would claim mental illness, get committed to a psychiatric facility, and eventually talk his way out. The true scope of Hatcher's crimes became apparent in July 1982, when 11-year-old Michelle Steele disappeared from St. Joseph, Missouri. Her nude body was discovered on the banks of the Missouri River, bearing the horrific evidence of prolonged torture. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled, but this time, Hatcher made a crucial mistake. Instead of fleeing immediately, he attempted to check himself into the St. Joseph State Hospital, claiming he was having a mental breakdown. When police connected him to Michelle's murder, something inside Hatcher finally cracked. Perhaps it was the weight of carrying so many secrets, or maybe he simply enjoyed the attention, but he began to confess, not just to Michelle's murder, but to 15 others spanning over a decade. He provided investigators with a hand-drawn map showing the location of a previously undiscovered victim in Bettendorf, Iowa. The body was exactly where he said it would be. Hatcher's confessions revealed the true extent of his manipulation of the mental health system. He had learned the right words to say, the symptoms to fake, and the legal loopholes to exploit. He understood that claiming insanity was far preferable to facing execution, and he had perfected this performance over decades. Mental health professionals who had evaluated him described him as one of the most manipulative individuals they had ever encountered. During his interrogations, Hatcher showed no remorse for his victims. Instead, he seemed proud of his ability to evade capture for so long. He bragged about the murders he had committed that police hadn't even connected to him yet. He described in clinical detail how he had selected his victims, how he had gained their trust, and how he had ended their lives. The detectives interviewing him later said they had never encountered someone so completely devoid of human empathy. Despite confessing to 16 murders, Hatcher was only convicted of 2, the murders of Eric Christian and Michelle Steele. The legal system that had failed to stop him for so many years was still struggling to hold him accountable. In October 1983, he received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 50 years for Christian's murder. A year later, facing his second conviction for Michelle Steele's death, Hatcher did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom. He requested the death penalty. The man who had spent decades manipulating the system to avoid execution was now begging for it. The jury refused his request, instead recommending another life sentence. Perhaps they understood that death would be too easy an escape for someone who had caused so much suffering. On December 3rd, 1984, Hatcher received his second life sentence. But Charles Ray Hatcher would not serve his time quietly. Just 4 days after his sentencing, guards found him dead in his solitary confinement cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary. He had hanged himself with a piece of electrical wire, finally taking control of his own fate the way he had controlled the fates of so many others. He was 55 years old, and with his death, the full truth about his crimes died with him. The case of Charles Ray Hatcher exposes the deadly flaws in how our society handles dangerous individuals who exploit mental illness as a shield. His victims' families were left with unanswered questions and a justice system that had failed them repeatedly. How many lives could have been saved if Hatcher had been properly evaluated and contained after his first serious offense? How many other predators are currently using similar tactics to avoid accountability? Hatcher's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear many masks, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who have learned to game the very systems designed to protect us. His legacy isn't just the 16 lives he claimed, but the broken trust in institutions that were supposed to keep monsters like him locked away from innocent victims. The most terrifying aspect of Charles Ray Hatcher's crimes wasn't just their brutality, but the systematic way he exploited every possible weakness in law enforcement and mental health systems. He understood that appearing crazy was better than appearing sane and guilty. He manipulated psychiatrists, social workers, judges, and parole boards with the same cold calculation he used to select his victims. In the end, Hatcher's suicide robbed his victims' families of the closure they deserved and ensured that many of his crimes would remain forever unsolved. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for dozens of additional murders that were never connected to him. His death was perhaps his final act of manipulation, denying justice to those he had wronged and taking his secrets to the grave. The name Charles Ray Hatcher may not be as well known as Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, but his impact on the families he destroyed and the communities he terrorized was just as devastating. Now let's turn our attention to Amy Archer Gilligan, a woman whose name might not ring a bell, but whose crimes would make your blood run cold. While most serial killers hunt in the shadows, Amy operated in plain sight, running what appeared to be a respectable nursing home in early 1900s Connecticut. Behind the facade of caring for the elderly, she was systematically poisoning her patients and pocketing their money. What makes her story even more chilling is how she almost got away with it, protected by the very respectability that made her crimes so unthinkable. Amy Dugan was born on Halloween night in 1873 in Milton, Connecticut. From the outside, she seemed destined for a conventional life. She married James Archer in 1896, and together they opened the Archer Home for elderly people and chronic invalids in Windsor, Connecticut. After James died in 1910, Amy continued running the facility, eventually remarrying a man named Michael Gilligan. To the community, she was a devoted caregiver, a woman who had dedicated her life to helping society's most vulnerable members. Neighbors saw her as industrious and compassionate, someone who took on the difficult task of caring for the elderly when their own families couldn't or wouldn't. But Amy Archer Gilligan had discovered something that would transform her from caregiver to killer. She realized that elderly people with money, isolated from their families, represented the perfect victims. They were vulnerable, often confused, and their deaths would rarely be questioned. After all, they were old and sick. Death was expected. What wasn't expected was that Amy would help it along. Her method was deceptively simple and horrifically effective. Amy would approach potential residents or their families, offering long-term care for a substantial upfront payment, often between $1,000 to $5,000, an enormous sum in those days. She promised that this single payment would cover all their needs for the rest of their lives. The families, relieved to have found a solution for their aging relatives, gladly paid. What they didn't realize was that Amy had no intention of providing care for very long. Once the residents moved in, Amy would begin her deadly routine. She would befriend them, gain their trust, and convince them to name her as the beneficiary of their life insurance policies. She would offer to help them with their banking, gradually gaining access to their accounts. Some residents would even loan her money, believing they were helping their caring hostess with temporary financial difficulties. Then, when Amy had extracted maximum financial benefit, she would serve them their final meal. Amy's weapon of choice was poison, typically arsenic or strychnine, substances that were readily available and could be easily disguised in food or drink. She had a particular fondness for serving poisoned lemonade on hot summer days, a gesture that seemed so thoughtful, so caring. The victims would experience agonizing deaths, writhing in pain as the poison coursed through their systems. But Amy would play the part of the concerned caregiver, holding their hands, offering comfort, all while knowing she was the cause of their suffering. The death toll at the Archer home was staggering. Between 1907 and 1917, 48 people died at the facility. For a small nursing home, this was an astronomical number. But Amy had carefully cultivated relationships with local doctors and officials, and she was skilled at providing plausible explanations for each death: old age, heart failure, natural causes. The paperwork was always in order, the death certificates properly signed. Amy understood that people didn't want to look too closely at the deaths of the elderly. It was easier to accept her explanations and move on. Amy's greed eventually extended beyond her patience. In 1914, she married Michael Gilligan, a man who had worked as a handyman around the facility. Michael was robust and healthy, but after their marriage, he began to feel unwell. He complained of stomach pains and weakness. Amy, ever the devoted wife, nursed him tenderly, bringing him meals and medicine. Michael died just 3 months after their wedding, and Amy collected on his life insurance policy. She had poisoned her own husband as callously as she had poisoned her patients. But Amy's reign of terror began to unravel because of one woman's relentless pursuit of justice. Nellie Pierce had watched her brother Franklin Andrews die at the Archer home in 1914, just 1 month after he had paid Amy $500 for his care. Nellie was suspicious from the beginning. Franklin had been in good health when he entered the facility, and his rapid decline and death seemed too convenient. When she tried to raise concerns with local authorities, they dismissed her as a grieving sister looking for someone to blame. Nellie refused to give up. She began conducting her own investigation, tracking down other families who had lost relatives at the Archer home. She discovered a disturbing pattern. Healthy people were entering the facility and dying within weeks or months. Large sums of money were being paid up front, with the promise of lifetime care that lasted only a fraction of a lifetime. Insurance policies were being changed to benefit Amy. The evidence was overwhelming, but local authorities continued to ignore her. Frustrated by the lack of official action, Nellie took her story to the Hartford Courant newspaper. The articles detailed the suspicious deaths, the financial arrangements, and the pattern of poisoning. The story created a sensation across Connecticut and beyond. Finally, public pressure forced authorities to act. The investigation that followed was thorough and damning. Bodies were exhumed from local cemeteries, and autopsies revealed lethal levels of arsenic and strychnine. Amy's financial records showed a clear pattern of profiting from deaths. Witnesses came forward with stories of Amy's suspicious behavior around the times of various deaths. The evidence was overwhelming, and Amy was arrested in May 1916. Amy's trial was a media sensation. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings, fascinated by the story of the respectable woman who had turned her nursing home into a death trap. The prosecution presented a methodical case, showing how Amy had systematically murdered her patients for money. They painted a picture of a woman so consumed by greed that she had lost all humanity, someone who could look into the eyes of a dying person and feel nothing but satisfaction at the profit their death would bring. Amy's defense team tried desperately to save her life. They argued that she was insane, that drug addiction had clouded her judgment, that she couldn't be held responsible for her actions. But the evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. On June 18, 1917, Amy Archer Gilligan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. She would be the first woman executed in Connecticut. However, Amy's legal troubles weren't over. Her lawyers appealed the conviction, and she was granted a new trial in 1919. This time, her defense focused heavily on her mental state, with her own daughter testifying about Amy's alleged morphine addiction and erratic behavior. The strategy worked to some degree. While Amy was again found guilty, the jury recommended mercy, and her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Amy spent the rest of her life in prison and later in a Connecticut psychiatric hospital, where she died in 1962 at the age of 89. She had lived longer than any of her victims, a final insult to the families she had destroyed. The exact number of her victims remains unknown, but investigators believe she may have killed as many as 100 people during her years of operation. The case of Amy Archer Gilligan exposed the vulnerability of the elderly in early 20th century America. It showed how someone could exploit society's discomfort with death and aging to commit horrific crimes. Her story became the inspiration for the classic play and film Arsenic and Old Lace, though the comedic treatment hardly captured the true horror of her crimes. What makes Amy's story particularly chilling is how she perverted the very concept of care. She took people who were seeking comfort and safety in their final years and turned their trust into a weapon against them. She smiled as she served them poison, held their hands as they died, and counted their money as their bodies were lowered into the ground. In a profession built on compassion and healing, Amy Archer Gilligan became the embodiment of greed and calculated evil. The families of her victims never truly recovered from the betrayal. They had entrusted their loved ones to someone they believed would care for them, only to discover that they had delivered them to a killer. The guilt and anguish of that realization haunted them for the rest of their lives. Gary Leon Ridgway seemed like any other man you might pass on the street. He worked at a truck painting facility, attended church regularly, and lived quietly with his third wife in a modest home south of Seattle. Neighbors described him as polite, unremarkable, even boring. But beneath this ordinary facade lurked one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. For nearly 2 decades, Ridgway systematically hunted, murdered, and disposed of dozens of women, earning him the terrifying moniker that would haunt the Pacific Northwest, the Green River Killer. The nightmare began on July 15, 1982, when 2 boys riding their bicycles near the Green River in Kent, Washington, discovered the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield floating in the shallow water. She had been strangled. Within a month, the 4 more bodies were found in and around the same river. Deborah Lynn Bonner, just 23 years old, Marcia Faye Chapman, 31, Cynthia Jean Hines, 17, Opal Charmaine Mills, only 16. All had been strangled. All had been dumped like garbage along the banks of the Green River. The victims shared disturbing similarities. Most were young women involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction. Many were runaways who had aged out of the foster care system with nowhere to go. They were society's forgotten vulnerable women who worked the strip along Pacific Highway South, a grimy stretch of road lined with cheap motels and truck stops. The killer knew exactly who to target. These women wouldn't be missed quickly. Their disappearances might go unreported for days or weeks, giving him time to kill again and again. What made Gary Ridgway so terrifyingly effective was his ability to blend seamlessly into normal society while methodically carrying out his crimes. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, in 1949, Ridgway had moved to Washington State as a child. His childhood was marked by a complicated relationship with his mother, whom he both loved and resented. He wet the bed until his teens, and his mother would humiliate him by bathing him in front of his brothers. This twisted dynamic with his mother may have contributed to his later hatred of women, particularly those he viewed as sexually promiscuous. By day, Ridgway worked as a spray painter at Kenworth Truck Company, a job he held for over 30 years. He was punctual, reliable, and kept to himself. He married 3 times, presenting himself as a devoted husband and churchgoer. His religious facade was particularly chilling. He would attend church services, participate in Bible study, and even try to save prostitutes by reading them scripture. But this wasn't genuine faith. It was theater, a calculated performance designed to deflect suspicion while he continued his killing spree. Ridgway's method was devastatingly simple. He would cruise the SeaTac Strip in his truck, sometimes with his young son in the passenger seat, looking for potential victims. He learned that showing pictures of his son to prostitutes would make them trust him more, seeing him as a family man rather than a threat. Once he gained their confidence, he would drive them to secluded areas near the Green River or other remote locations. There, he would strangle them with his bare hands or use ligatures. He later admitted that he preferred manual strangulation because he could feel the life leaving their bodies. The disposal of bodies became a grotesque ritual for Ridgway. He would often return to dump sites to have sex with the decomposing corpses, sometimes moving bodies to different locations to confuse investigators. He placed rocks or other objects in the victims' vaginas to make it appear as though someone else had committed the crimes. He would also pose the bodies in degrading positions, treating these women as objects even in death. Some victims were buried in shallow graves, others left exposed to the elements, and many were never found at all. As the body count mounted, the Green River Task Force was formed in 1984, becoming one of the largest serial killer investigations in United States history. At its peak, the task force included dozens of detectives, FBI profilers, and support staff. They interviewed thousands of suspects, followed countless leads, and spent millions of dollars trying to catch the killer. Gary Ridgway was actually interviewed by investigators multiple times throughout the 1980s and 1990s. In 1984, he was arrested for soliciting an undercover police officer posing as a prostitute. When questioned about the Green River murders, he passed a polygraph test and was released. The investigation continued for years with frustratingly few results. Bodies kept appearing. Women kept disappearing. The killer seemed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement, adapting his methods to avoid detection. He began dumping bodies farther from the Green River, scattering them across multiple counties to divide investigative resources. He would sometimes cluster several bodies in one area, then move to a completely different location, making it nearly impossible for investigators to predict where he might strike next. What finally brought down Gary Ridgway wasn't brilliant detective work or a lucky break. It was the advancement of DNA technology. In 1987, investigators had collected samples from several suspects, including Ridgway. At the time, DNA analysis was still in its infancy and couldn't provide definitive matches. But as the technology improved throughout the 1990s, those old samples became invaluable evidence. In 2001, nearly 20 years after the first Green River murder, forensic scientists were able to match Ridgway's DNA to genetic material found on several victims. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested at his workplace. The unassuming truck painter, who had evaded capture for 2 decades, was finally in custody. The arrest sent shockwaves through the Pacific Northwest. This ordinary-looking man, who had been living quietly among them for years, was responsible for one of the most extensive murder sprees in American history. During interrogations, Ridgway initially denied involvement in the murders, but as DNA evidence mounted against him, he realized his situation was hopeless. Facing the death penalty, he eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for life imprisonment without parole. What followed were months of chilling confessions that revealed the true scope of his crimes. Ridgway confessed to murdering 48 women, though he claimed the actual number was closer to 70 or 80. He admitted that he had killed so many victims that he couldn't remember them all. He drew maps showing investigators where he had dumped bodies, leading them to remains that had been missing for decades. He described his victims not as human beings, but as possessions, referring to them by the locations where he had disposed of their bodies rather than their names. The confessions revealed the calculated nature of Ridgway's crimes. He explained how he would sometimes place the bodies of recent victims near older remains to contaminate crime scenes with aged DNA. He described returning to dump sites months or years later to move bodies, ensuring that investigators would never have a complete picture of his activities. He admitted to necrophilia, explaining that he returned to have sex with decomposing corpses because dead victims couldn't fight back or identify him later. Perhaps most chilling was Ridgway's complete lack of remorse. During his confession sessions, he spoke about the murders matter-of-factly, as if discussing routine maintenance on his truck. He showed no emotion when describing how he had strangled teenage girls or dumped their bodies in remote forests. When asked why he targeted prostitutes, he coldly explained that he thought he could kill them without getting caught, because he believed society didn't care about them. The victims' families were forced to sit through hours of Ridgway's confessions, listening to him describe in clinical detail how their daughters, sisters, and mothers had died. Some families found closure in finally knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Others were devastated by the graphic details of their final moments. All were haunted by the realization that this unremarkable man had stolen so many lives while living freely among them for decades. In December 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 480 years for tampering with evidence. He was later convicted of a 49th murder in 2011. The Green River Killer case exposed troubling realities about how society treats its most vulnerable members. Ridgway specifically chose victims he believed wouldn't be missed, and in many cases, he was right. Some of the women had been estranged from their families for years. Others were foster children with no permanent support system. Many had struggled with addiction or mental illness, making them easy targets for predators. The investigation revealed that several victims had been reported missing multiple times, only to have their cases closed when they briefly returned to the streets. Today, Gary Ridgway remains imprisoned at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He spends his days in protective custody, separated from other inmates who might target him for his crimes. He has granted few interviews over the years, maintaining his emotionless demeanor when discussing his murders. Now in his 70s, he will die in prison, having stolen decades of life from dozens of women while living freely among an unknowing community. The true horror of Gary Ridgway lies not just in the number of his victims, but in how easily he was able to hide in plain sight. For 20 years, he went to work, attended church, and maintained relationships while systematically hunting and killing women. His case serves as a terrifying reminder that the most dangerous predators often look exactly like everyone else. Moving from the calculated predations of Gary Ridgway, we turn to an even more disturbing case that unfolded in the early 20th century American South. The Atlanta Ripper terrorized Georgia's capital city for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of brutalized bodies and unanswered questions that persist to this day. Unlike other serial killers who eventually faced justice, the Atlanta Ripper's identity remains unknown, making this case one of America's most chilling, unsolved mysteries. The nightmare began in 1909, though some accounts suggest the killing spree started as early as 1907. What made these murders particularly terrifying was their systematic nature and the horrific brutality inflicted upon the victims. The killer, or killers, targeted African American women almost exclusively, exploiting the racial tensions and social inequalities of the Jim Crow South to operate with near impunity. The victims were primarily working-class black women, many of whom were domestic workers, laundresses, or women forced into prostitution by economic desperation. They ranged in age from teenagers to middle-aged mothers, but all shared the tragic vulnerability of being marginalized by a society that offered them little protection. The killer seemed to understand this vulnerability, deliberately choosing victims whose disappearances might not be immediately investigated by authorities who showed little interest in crimes against black women. What earned this unknown predator the moniker Atlanta Ripper was the savage nature of the attacks. The murders bore disturbing similarities to the infamous Jack the Ripper killings in London's Whitechapel district. Victims were found with their throats slashed so deeply that they were nearly decapitated. Many showed signs of torture and mutilation. In several cases, internal organs had been removed with what appeared to be surgical precision, suggesting the killer possessed anatomical knowledge or medical training. A particularly disturbing pattern emerged in the timing of the murders. Many of the killings occurred on Saturday nights, with bodies discovered early Sunday morning. This consistency suggested a methodical predator who planned his attacks carefully, possibly someone who worked a regular schedule and used weekends to hunt for victims. The Saturday night pattern also coincided with when many working women would have been paid and might be carrying small amounts of money, suggesting robbery could have been a secondary motive. The geographical distribution of the murders painted a picture of a killer who knew Atlanta intimately. Bodies were found in various neighborhoods across the city, from downtown areas to outlying districts. Some victims were discovered in their own homes, indicating the killer was able to gain entry either through force or by earning their trust. Others were found in alleyways, vacant lots, or along railroad tracks, suggesting they had been lured to isolated locations or killed elsewhere and dumped. One of the most horrifying aspects of the Atlanta Ripper case was the escalating brutality of the attacks. Early victims, while savagely murdered, showed relatively straightforward patterns of violence. But as the killing spree continued, the mutilations became more elaborate and ritualistic. One victim was found with her heart completely removed from her chest. Another had been so severely mutilated that she was nearly unrecognizable. The escalation suggested a killer who was becoming more confident and deriving increasing satisfaction from the act of murder itself. The investigation into the Atlanta Ripper murders was hampered from the beginning by the racial prejudices of the era. Many white authorities showed little interest in crimes against black women, viewing them as less worthy of protection or justice. When investigations did occur, they were often perfunctory, with little effort made to preserve crime scenes or collect evidence. This institutional neglect allowed the killer to operate with relative freedom, knowing that his crimes were unlikely to be thoroughly investigated. Despite the challenges, several suspects were arrested over the years. In 1911, police detained a man named Henry Huff in connection with some of the murders. Huff was described as a drifter who had been seen in the vicinity of several crime scenes. However, the evidence against him was largely circumstantial, and he was eventually released. Other suspects included transient workers, mentally ill individuals, and men with histories of violence against women. But none of these arrests led to convictions, and the murders continued. The case took on additional complexity when investigators began to suspect that more than one killer might be responsible for the murders. The geographical spread of the crimes, variations in the methods of killing, and the extended time frame of the spree all suggested the possibility of multiple perpetrators. Some theories proposed that the Atlanta Ripper was actually a group of killers, possibly working together or independently, but using similar methods. This theory would explain why the murders continued even after suspects were arrested, and why the killer seemed to possess extensive knowledge of different areas of the city. Public fear reached a fever pitch during the spring of 1911, when the frequency of murders increased dramatically. In a 3-month period, 6 women were found brutally murdered, their bodies bearing the characteristic signs of the Ripper's handiwork. The black community, already marginalized and vulnerable, lived in constant terror. Women were afraid to venture out alone, especially at night. Families organized neighborhood watch groups, and many women began carrying weapons for protection. The media coverage of the Atlanta Ripper case reflected the racial attitudes of the time. White newspapers often portrayed the victims in derogatory terms, suggesting they were somehow responsible for their own deaths due to their lifestyle or circumstances. This victim blaming not only reflected societal prejudices, but also served to reduce public pressure for a thorough investigation. The black press, conversely, demanded justice and highlighted the failures of law enforcement to protect African American women. As the years passed and the murders continued, theories about the killer's identity proliferated. Some suspected a member of the medical profession pointing to the surgical precision of the mutilations. Others believed the killer was someone in a position of authority who could move freely through different neighborhoods without suspicion. There were whispers about wealthy white men who could afford to pay for the silence of witnesses or the corruption of investigators. The Atlanta Ripper case also occurred during a period of intense racial violence in the South. The Atlanta Race Massacre of 1906 had already demonstrated the deadly consequences of racial hatred, and the ongoing murders created additional tensions in an already volatile social environment. Some historians suggest that the failure to solve the Ripper murders contributed to the atmosphere of fear and mistrust that characterized race relations in early 20th century Atlanta. By 1915, the frequency of murders that fit the Atlanta Ripper pattern began to decline, though similar killings continued sporadically into the 1920s. Whether this indicated that the original killer had died, moved away, or simply changed his methods remains unknown. The case gradually faded from public attention, becoming one of many unsolved mysteries in a city struggling with rapid growth and social change. The total number of victims attributed to the Atlanta Ripper varies depending on the source, with estimates ranging from 15 to over 50 women. The uncertainty reflects the chaotic nature of the investigation and the likelihood that some murders went undetected or were attributed to other causes. Many potential victims were poor women whose deaths might not have been thoroughly investigated or properly documented. Today, more than a century later, the Atlanta Ripper case remains officially unsolved. The passage of time has made it unlikely that the killer's identity will ever be definitively established. Physical evidence from the crime scenes has long since been lost or destroyed, and all potential witnesses are dead. However, the case continues to fascinate criminologists and true crime enthusiasts who study it for insights into early serial killing patterns and the intersection of crime with social inequality. The Atlanta Ripper represents more than just an unsolved murder case. It stands as a stark reminder of how societal prejudices can enable predators to operate with impunity. The killer, whoever he was, understood that his victims were vulnerable, not just physically, but socially. He knew that crimes against black women in the Jim Crow South would not receive the same attention or resources as crimes against white victims. The case of the Atlanta Ripper represents one of the most disturbing and frustrating chapters in American true crime history, not just because of the brutality of the murders, but because of how society's failures allowed a monster to operate with virtual impunity. Between 1911 and 1915, an unknown killer stalked the streets of Atlanta, Georgia, targeting black women with a savagery that earned him the moniker Atlanta Ripper, drawing chilling comparisons to Jack the Ripper's reign of terror in London. What made this case particularly horrifying was the methodical nature of the attacks. The killer had a preferred schedule, striking almost exclusively on Saturday nights, which meant that nearly every Sunday morning brought the grim discovery of another mutilated body. This pattern created a climate of absolute terror in Atlanta's black community, where women lived in constant fear as each weekend approached. The consistency was no coincidence. It suggested a predator who was organized, deliberate, and possibly even employed during the week, using his free time to hunt. The victims were primarily black women from vulnerable populations, many working as prostitutes or struggling to survive in a city still rebuilding from the Civil War's devastation. The killer's method was consistently brutal, almost always involving throat slashing and severe mutilation that went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. In several cases, victims were found with their heads nearly severed, and in one particularly grotesque discovery, a woman was found with her heart completely removed from her body. The killer also had a bizarre signature, often removing his victims' shoes and taking them as trophies, leaving investigators puzzled by this strange detail. What makes the Atlanta Ripper case so infuriating is how the investigation was handled, or more accurately, how it wasn't handled. Despite the escalating body count and the clear pattern of murders, law enforcement's response was hampered by the racial attitudes of the era. These weren't just individual crimes being ignored, they represented a systematic devaluation of black women's lives that allowed a serial killer to operate freely. The victims were often dismissed as prostitutes whose deaths weren't worth serious investigation, a tragic example of how societal prejudice can literally be a matter of life and death. The spring of 1911 was particularly terrifying for Atlanta's black community. Bodies were discovered with such regularity that residents began to dread Sunday mornings, knowing they might wake up to news of another horrific murder. The killer seemed to be escalating, not just in frequency, but in the level of mutilation he inflicted. Some victims were found posed in deliberately shocking positions, suggesting the killer wanted maximum impact when the bodies were discovered. This wasn't just murder, it was psychological warfare against an entire community. Despite the mounting evidence and the clear pattern, the Atlanta Police Department's investigation was woefully inadequate. While 6 different men were arrested in connection with the crimes over the years, none were ever convicted. The investigations lacked the thoroughness and resources that would have been devoted to similar crimes had the victims been white women from affluent neighborhoods. This wasn't incompetence, it was institutional racism manifesting as investigative neglect. The case took on additional significance because of its timing in American history. This was the era of Jim Crow laws, when lynchings were common and racial tensions were at a boiling point. Some historians believe the Atlanta Ripper murders contributed to the broader climate of fear and racial unrest that periodically erupted into violence throughout the South. The killer wasn't just terrorizing individual women, he was destabilizing an entire community already living under the constant threat of racial violence. One of the most chilling aspects of the Atlanta Ripper case is how it demonstrates the intersection of multiple forms of vulnerability. The victims were targeted not just because they were women, but because they were black women, often poor, often involved in sex work, and living in a society that viewed them as disposable. The killer understood this social dynamic and exploited it, knowing that his crimes would receive minimal attention from authorities. The geographic pattern of the murders also revealed the killer's intimate knowledge of Atlanta's black neighborhoods. Bodies were often dumped in areas where they would be discovered quickly, usually by other members of the black community, maximizing the psychological impact while minimizing the killer's risk of being caught by police patrols. This suggests someone who either lived in these neighborhoods or had reason to frequent them regularly. What's particularly disturbing is how the killer seemed to escalate, not just in frequency, but in the level of ritualistic behavior. The removal of shoes became a consistent signature, and the increasing mutilation suggested someone who was growing more confident and more sadistic with each attack. The heart removal incident represents a level of anatomical knowledge and post-mortem mutilation that suggests either medical training or extensive practice on previous victims whose bodies were never found. But the failure to solve the Atlanta Ripper case had lasting consequences beyond the immediate victims. It sent a clear message to Atlanta's black community that their lives didn't matter to the authorities, deepening mistrust of law enforcement that persisted for generations. It also emboldened other criminals who saw that violence against black women could be committed with virtual impunity. Today, the Atlanta Ripper case remains officially unsolved, though modern criminal profilers and historians have attempted to piece together what they can from the limited evidence that still exists. The case file, what remains of it, tells a story not just of a serial killer, but of a society that allowed him to operate through its own indifference and prejudice. The Atlanta Ripper represents something more sinister than just an individual monster. He was enabled by a system that devalued his victims' lives, investigated their deaths half-heartedly, and ultimately allowed him to disappear into history without ever being held accountable. The real horror isn't just in what he did to those women, but in how society's failures made it possible. Now we come to Alfred Gainor, a name that barely registers in most discussions of serial killers, yet his story reveals one of the most devastating aspects of how society fails its most vulnerable members. Between 1995 and 1998, Gainor stalked the streets of Springfield, Massachusetts, systematically hunting women who lived on the margins of society. His victims weren't random strangers. They were women struggling with addiction, poverty, and survival, women whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive search efforts or media attention. This invisibility became their death sentence. Alfred J. Gainor was born on December 10, 1966, in Springfield, the same city where he would later become a predator. His early life remains largely undocumented, a shadow existence that mirrors the lives of his future victims. What we do know is that by his 20s, Gainor was trapped in the cycle of addiction that plagued many in his community. He worked low-skilled jobs, bouncing between automobile repair shops and manual labor, presenting a facade of normalcy while battling demons that would eventually consume him entirely. His drug addiction wasn't just a personal struggle, it became the hunting ground where he would find his victims. The connection between Gainor and his victims was tragically simple: crack cocaine. In the mid-1980s, the crack epidemic had devastated communities across America, and Springfield was no exception. Women desperate for their next fix would encounter Gainor during drug transactions, in crack houses, or on street corners where both buyer and seller congregated. These brief encounters, born from mutual desperation, created opportunities that Gainor would exploit with calculating brutality. He understood that these women existed in a world where disappearances were common, where days might pass before anyone noticed they were gone. On April 20th, 1995, the body of 45-year-old Vera E. Hallams was discovered in her Springfield apartment, marking the beginning of Gainor's documented killing spree. Vera had made the fatal mistake of inviting Gainor into her home, perhaps for drugs, perhaps for companionship. Once inside, Gaynor waited until she fell asleep before launching his attack. He tied her up, beat her mercilessly, causing the brain injuries that would kill her. But death wasn't enough for Gaynor. After Vera died, he raped her corpse, robbed her apartment for anything of value, and fled into the night. Her body lay undiscovered for days, a horrifying preview of the pattern that would define his crimes. What made Gaynor particularly disturbing wasn't just the murders themselves, but the deliberate cruelty he inflicted beyond death. Police and prosecutors would later reveal that he frequently posed his victims' bodies in grotesque positions, apparently with the intent to maximize the shock and trauma of whoever found them. In several heartbreaking cases, it was the victims' own young children who discovered their mothers' bodies, a detail that transforms these crimes from acts of violence into deliberate torture of entire families. This wasn't random brutality. It was calculated psychological warfare against communities already struggling to survive. The 3-month period between late 1997 and early 1998 represented the peak of Gaynor's killing spree, a concentrated burst of violence that terrorized Springfield's most vulnerable neighborhoods. During this time, he murdered Joanne C. Thomas, Loretta Daniels, Rosemary Downs, and Joyce Dickerson P., 4 women whose lives intersected with his through the dark world of addiction and desperation. Each murder followed his established pattern, gaining access through drug connections, sexual assault, murder, robbery, and the grotesque positioning of bodies. The frequency of these killings created a climate of terror in communities where women were already living in fear. The investigation into these murders revealed the same systemic failures we've seen throughout this series. Because the victims were primarily women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, their cases didn't receive the immediate attention or resources that other victims might have garnered. Days would pass before missing person reports were filed. Crime scenes were often contaminated by the time police arrived. Witnesses, many of whom were also involved in illegal activities, were reluctant to come forward. Gaynor exploited these gaps in the system, understanding that his chosen victims existed in a world where violence was common and justice was rare. Gaynor's capture came on April 10th, 1998, not through brilliant detective work, but through the accumulation of forensic evidence that finally linked him definitively to his crimes. DNA analysis and fingerprint evidence provided the irrefutable connections that eyewitness testimony couldn't deliver. In 2000, he was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The forensic technology that finally caught him had been advancing throughout his killing spree, creating an invisible net that slowly closed around him even as he continued to kill. But perhaps the most shocking chapter in Gaynor's story came 8 years after his conviction. In 2008, while serving his life sentences, Gaynor approached the Hampton County Attorney's Office with an unexpected proposition. He offered to confess to additional murders in exchange for a plea agreement, but his motivations weren't entirely selfish. Among his confessions was the 1996 murder of 20-year-old Amy Smith, a crime for which his nephew, Paul Fickling, had already been convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Gaynor's confession was driven by a desire to free his nephew from a wrongful conviction, revealing a complex web of family loyalty and manipulation that added another layer to his already disturbing story. The confession expanded Gainor's confirmed victim count to 9 women: Vera Helms, Jill Ann Ermelini, Robin Atkins, Yvette Torres, and Amy Smith, in addition to the 4 murders for which he was already convicted. Each name represented not just a life lost, but a family destroyed, children left motherless, and communities left to wonder how many more victims might remain undiscovered. The fact that he had additional victims beyond his original convictions highlighted the likelihood that other serial killers featured in this series may also have higher body counts than officially recognized. Paul Fickling's case became a disturbing subplot in the Gainor story. He had spent years in prison for a murder committed by his uncle, a victim of both a flawed justice system and his own family's darkest member. Following Gainor's confession, Fickling's murder charge was reduced to manslaughter, and he received a new sentence, but the years he lost to wrongful imprisonment could never be recovered. This case within a case illustrated how the damage caused by serial killers extends far beyond their direct victims, creating ripple effects that destroy innocent lives and expose the fragility of our justice system. Today, Alfred Gainor remains in prison, serving multiple life sentences in a Massachusetts correctional facility. Unlike some of the other killers we've discussed, he has shown no interest in publicity or notoriety. He exists in the shadows of the prison system, just as he existed in the shadows of society during his killing spree. His victims, however, deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a criminal case, but as women who struggled with circumstances that made them vulnerable to predators like Gainor. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives mattered far more than the society that failed to protect them recognized. The case of Alfred Gainor forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we value different lives in our society. His victims were chosen specifically because they existed on the margins, because their disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate alarm, because the systems meant to protect them had already failed them long before they encountered their killer. This pattern of targeting the vulnerable, which we've seen repeated throughout each case in this series, reveals a systematic problem that extends far beyond individual criminals. What makes these forgotten serial killers so disturbing isn't just their individual acts of violence, but what they reveal about the society that allowed them to operate. Charles Ray Hatcher manipulated mental health systems designed to help him. Amy Archer Gilligan exploited the trust placed in caregivers. Gary Ridgway hunted women society had already abandoned. The Atlanta Ripper terrorized a community whose cries for help were ignored due to racial prejudice. And Alfred Gainor stalked women whose addictions and poverty made them invisible to the very systems meant to protect them. These cases share common threads that extend far beyond their individual circumstances. Each killer identified and exploited specific vulnerabilities in both their victims and the systems meant to protect them. They understood instinctively that certain lives were valued less than others, that certain disappearances would generate less attention, that certain communities had less political power to demand justice. This knowledge became their hunting license, allowing them to kill repeatedly while authorities struggled to connect dots that should have formed clear patterns. The fact that these killers remain largely unknown to the general public isn't accidental. Their stories don't fit the neat narratives we prefer about serial killers. They weren't brilliant masterminds playing games with police. They weren't collecting trophies or taunting investigators. They were simply predators who understood how to exploit the gaps in our social safety net, killing methodically while hiding in plain sight. But the most insidious aspect of these killers wasn't just their individual brutality. It was how they weaponized society's own blind spots against itself. Each of these predators understood something dark about human nature, that we're willing to look away from certain kinds of victims, certain kinds of places, certain kinds of people. They didn't just exploit their victims, they exploited our collective indifference. Charles Ray Hatcher perfected this manipulation to an art form. For over 2 decades, he drifted between mental institutions, juvenile facilities, and county jails like a ghost in the system. Every time authorities got close, Hatcher would claim mental illness, feign incompetence, or simply disappear into the bureaucratic maze of America's fractured mental health infrastructure. He understood that the system was designed to pass problems along rather than solve them, and he used that knowledge to stay one step ahead of justice. In 1969, Hatcher walked into a California courtroom facing child molestation charges. The very next day, 12-year-old William Freeman disappeared from Antioch, California. The boy's strangled body was found weeks later, but by then Hatcher had already manipulated his way into a mental health facility, claiming he was too disturbed to stand trial. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was calculation. Hatcher had learned that the moment legal pressure mounted, he could retreat into the protective shell of mental incompetence, and the system would shelter him rather than pursue him. This pattern repeated itself across multiple states and decades. When police in Missouri began investigating a series of child disappearances in the early 1980s, Hatcher was already on their radar. But every time they brought him in for questioning, he would either claim amnesia, fake a mental breakdown, or simply tell investigators what they wanted to hear before slipping away again. He bounced between Illinois, Missouri, California, and Nebraska, leaving a trail of missing children and frustrated law enforcement officials who couldn't make charges stick. The most chilling example of Hatcher's manipulation came in 1982 when 11-year-old Michelle Steele was found murdered on the banks of the Missouri River in St. Joseph. Her nude body showed signs of brutal beating and strangulation, and the crime scene suggested someone with experience in violence against children. Within hours of the discovery, Charles Ray Hatcher walked into the St. Joseph State Hospital, attempting to check himself in as a voluntary mental patient. It was a move he'd made dozens of times before, seeking sanctuary in the very institutions that were supposed to protect society from people like him. But this time, something was different. Maybe it was the brutality of Michelle's murder. Maybe it was the mounting pressure from decades of unsolved cases, or maybe Hatcher simply realized his game was finally up. Whatever the reason, when police arrested him for Michelle's murder, the mask slipped completely. For the first time in his criminal career, Charles Ray Hatcher began to tell the truth. What emerged from his confessions was a map of horror stretching back over 13 years. Hatcher admitted to 16 murders, providing details that only the killer could know. He drew maps showing where bodies were buried, described personal belongings taken from victims, and revealed the locations of crime scenes that had never been discovered. In Bettendorf, Iowa, police used Hatcher's directions to find the remains of a victim who had been missing for years, buried in a location so remote that only someone intimately familiar with the area could have known about it. The most disturbing aspect of Hatcher's confessions wasn't the number of victims, it was the methodical way he had selected them. He targeted children who were alone, vulnerable, or from families too poor or disorganized to mount effective searches when they disappeared. He understood that certain victims would generate less attention, fewer resources, smaller headlines. In his twisted logic, he had identified the children that society was most likely to forget, and he had hunted them systematically. But Hatcher's true genius for evil lay in his understanding of institutional weakness. He recognized that mental health facilities, juvenile detention centers, and county jails operated in isolation from each other, with minimal communication and maximum bureaucracy. A crime committed in California wouldn't necessarily be linked to suspicious behavior in Missouri. A mental health evaluation in Illinois wouldn't trigger alerts in Nebraska. Hatcher moved through these gaps like water through a sieve, always finding new places to hide when the old ones became dangerous. Even more disturbing was how he exploited society's conflicted attitude toward mental illness. In the 1960s and 70s, there was growing awareness that the mentally ill were often warehoused inappropriately, denied proper treatment, and stigmatized unfairly. Hatcher weaponized this newfound compassion, using society's desire to treat mental illness with more humanity as a shield for his predatory behavior. Every time he claimed to hear voices, complained of memory loss, or exhibited bizarre behavior in court, well-meaning professionals gave him the benefit of the doubt. They wanted to help him, and he used their desire to help as a tool for continued hunting. The tragic irony is that the system's attempts to be more humane actually enabled more inhumanity. Hatcher wasn't mentally ill in any traditional sense. He was calculating, organized, and fully aware of the consequences of his actions. But he understood that claiming mental illness would buy him time, create reasonable doubt, and generate sympathy from juries who might be reluctant to execute someone who seemed disturbed rather than evil. This exploitation reached its peak during his multiple competency hearings. Hatcher would arrive in court disheveled and confused, claiming he couldn't remember basic facts about his life or the charges against him. Court-appointed psychiatrists would evaluate him, often concluding that he was unfit to stand trial. He would be sent to a mental health facility for treatment, where he would gradually improve until he was deemed competent, at which point the legal process would resume. But by then, witnesses had moved, evidence had degraded, and prosecutors had moved on to newer cases. Hatcher turned the legal system's safeguards into a revolving door. The most chilling example of this manipulation occurred in 1979, when Hatcher was arrested in connection with the disappearance of two young boys in Missouri. The evidence against him was circumstantial but compelling. He had been seen with both children shortly before they vanished. He had lied repeatedly about his whereabouts, and his behavior during questioning was suspicious. But when the case went to trial, Hatcher appeared in court as a broken, confused man who could barely remember his own name. The jury, faced with what appeared to be a mentally ill defendant and circumstantial evidence, acquitted him on grounds of reasonable doubt. Within months of his acquittal, more children began disappearing from the same area. The pattern was always the same: vulnerable kids, often from troubled homes, who would vanish without a trace. Local police suspected Hatcher, but they couldn't prove anything, and his recent acquittal made them reluctant to pursue him aggressively. Meanwhile, Hatcher continued his deadly game, protected by a legal system that had been designed to prevent the execution of innocent people, but was instead enabling the continued predation of the guilty. The full scope of Hatcher's crimes may never be known. His 16 confessions represented only the murders he chose to admit, and investigators believe the actual number could be much higher. During his decades of drifting between institutions, there were countless opportunities for violence that were never investigated, never connected, never solved. Children who disappeared during periods when Hatcher was in the area, but whose cases were handled by different jurisdictions with no communication between them. What makes Hatcher's story so disturbing isn't just the individual evil he represented, but the systematic failures that enabled him. Every institution that encountered him, from mental hospitals to juvenile detention centers to local police departments, had pieces of the puzzle. But no one ever put those pieces together until it was far too late. The system that was supposed to protect society's most vulnerable members instead created the perfect hunting ground for someone who understood how to exploit institutional weaknesses. When Charles Ray Hatcher was finally convicted and sentenced to life in prison, he didn't express remorse for his victims or relief that his killing spree was over. Instead, he complained about the conditions of his confinement and continued to manipulate anyone who would listen. Even behind bars, he remained convinced that he was smarter than the system, that he had beaten the game for decades and only been caught through bad luck rather than good police work. In a sense, he was right. Hatcher's capture wasn't the result of brilliant detective work or advances in forensic science. It was simply the moment when his luck finally ran out, when the institutional failures that had protected him for so long finally aligned against him. But by then, the damage was irreversible. 16 families had lost children, countless others had lived in terror, and an entire generation of law enforcement had learned hard lessons about the price of institutional incompetence. 4 days after his final sentencing, Charles Ray Hatcher was found dead in his cell, having hanged himself with electrical wire. Even in death, he maintained control, denying society the satisfaction of a full accounting of his crimes and taking whatever secrets remained to his grave. The horror doesn't end with their capture. What makes these killers truly terrifying isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how they manipulated every system designed to protect society. They turned our most trusted institutions into hunting grounds, exploiting the very foundations of human decency to feed their insatiable hunger for destruction. Charles Ray Hatcher perfected the art of institutional manipulation over 3 decades. He didn't just evade capture, he weaponized the mental health system itself. Whenever authorities closed in, Hatcher would simply check himself into a psychiatric facility, claiming mental illness. Hospital staff, bound by patient confidentiality and lacking communication with law enforcement, became unwitting accomplices in his reign of terror. He cycled through at least 12 different mental institutions across multiple states, each time convincing doctors he was improving, each time walking away to kill again. His manipulation was surgical in its precision. Hatcher understood that the system valued rehabilitation over punishment, therapy over incarceration. He learned the language of recovery, mimicking the behaviors of genuine patients while planning his next murder. Hospital records show he was articulate, cooperative, even helpful to staff. One doctor noted that Hatcher demonstrated remarkable insight into his condition, describing his violent urges as manageable through proper medication. What the doctor didn't know was that Hatcher was already planning the abduction of his next victim, a 12-year-old boy he would strangle just days after his release. The legal system proved equally ineffective against his calculated deception. When arrested for lesser crimes, Hatcher would plead incompetent to stand trial, securing transfer to mental facilities rather than prison. Court-appointed psychiatrists, working with limited information and no access to his full criminal history across state lines, repeatedly declared him mentally ill but not dangerous. One evaluation stated that while Hatcher showed signs of personality disorder, he posed no significant threat to public safety. This assessment was written just months before he murdered Michelle Steele. What made Hatcher particularly dangerous was his intelligence. IQ tests administered during his various hospitalizations consistently scored him above average. He wasn't a mindless killer driven by uncontrollable impulses. He was a predator who studied the system designed to contain him, learning its weaknesses, exploiting its compassion. He kept detailed mental notes on which hospitals had the most lenient security, which doctors were most susceptible to manipulation, which legal jurisdictions lacked communication with others. His victims were chosen with the same calculated precision. Hatcher targeted children and young men from broken families, runaways, kids whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive searches. He understood that missing person investigations were often hampered by jurisdictional disputes, that evidence could be lost in bureaucratic shuffles between agencies. When 11-year-old Michelle Steele's body was found, investigators discovered that Hatcher had been a suspect in similar cases across 4 different states, but no single agency had the complete picture of his crimes. The system's failure wasn't just administrative, it was moral. Hatcher confessed to 16 murders, but investigators believed the true number could be much higher. He admitted to killing children whose bodies were never found, whose names were never reported, whose families never knew what happened to them. These were society's most vulnerable members, and the institutions meant to protect them instead provided their killer with sanctuary. Amy Archer Gilligan operated within an even more insidious framework of societal neglect. She didn't just run a nursing home, she ran a death factory disguised as compassionate care. Her victims weren't random strangers. They were people who trusted her with their final years, who paid her to ease their suffering, not to cause it. The elderly residents of her facility died in agony, poisoned by the very person they believed was caring for them. What makes Archer Gilligan's crimes especially chilling is how she perverted the concept of mercy itself. Families brought their loved ones to her facility, seeking comfort and dignity in their final days. Instead, they paid for elaborate murders disguised as natural deaths. She collected insurance payouts on victims who died just weeks after arriving, their life savings transferred to her accounts through forged documents and coerced wills. The nursing home industry in early 20th century Connecticut was virtually unregulated. Archer Gilligan exploited this regulatory vacuum with ruthless efficiency. She forged medical records, bribed local officials, and maintained relationships with doctors who signed death certificates without conducting proper examinations. When concerned family members questioned the high mortality rate at her facility, she would produce fabricated medical documentation showing her victims had suffered from various terminal illnesses. Her method was both simple and sophisticated. Arsenic and strychnine were readily available, often used as rat poison or in other household applications. She would mix these substances into medicine, food, or drinks, creating symptoms that mimicked natural illness. Victims would experience severe stomach pain, convulsions, and respiratory distress before dying in apparent agony. Their families, trusting Archer Gilligan's medical explanations, rarely questioned these deaths. The financial structure of her operation reveals the systematic nature of her crimes. Residents paid substantial upfront fees for lifetime care, with additional payments required for special services or medical treatment. Archer Gilligan would encourage families to pay these fees immediately, often suggesting that their loved ones required expensive treatments. She would then poison the residents within weeks of receiving payment, keeping the money while eliminating the obligation to provide actual care. Local authorities initially dismissed concerns about the death rate at her facility. The victims were elderly, after all, and death was expected in such institutions. This attitude reflected broader societal indifference toward the elderly, viewing them as burdens rather than valued members of the community. Archer Gilligan understood this prejudice and exploited it ruthlessly. She knew that investigations into elderly deaths would be cursory, that families would be reluctant to question medical authority, that profit motive would be overlooked in favor of simpler explanations. Gary Ridgway's crimes exposed the devastating intersection of social prejudice and investigative failure. For nearly 2 decades, he murdered women with virtual impunity, protected not by sophisticated planning, but by society's indifference to his victims. The women he killed were sex workers, runaways, and drug addicts, people whose disappearances were often dismissed as inevitable rather than investigated as crimes. Ridgway understood this social hierarchy with predatory precision. He specifically targeted women he knew wouldn't be missed, whose cases wouldn't receive priority attention from law enforcement. His victim selection wasn't random, it was strategic. He studied the areas where vulnerable women congregated, learning their routines, understanding their desperation. He would approach them with offers of money for sex, presenting himself as just another customer in transactions that occurred hundreds of times each night along the same strips of highway. His modus operandi revealed a chilling efficiency. Ridgway would gain his victims' trust by showing them photographs of his young son, presenting himself as a family man rather than a predator. This manipulation was psychological as well as practical. He understood that many of his victims were mothers themselves, separated from their own children by addiction, poverty, or circumstance. The photographs created a false sense of connection, a moment of shared humanity that he would exploit to lead them to isolated locations where he could kill them without interruption. The disposal of bodies was equally calculated. Ridgway would transport victims to remote forested areas, often dumping them in clusters that investigators would later call dumping grounds. He would sometimes return to these locations to engage in necrophilia with decomposing corpses, or to move bodies to different locations when he feared discovery. This ongoing interaction with crime scenes demonstrated not just depravity, but strategic thinking. He was actively managing his crimes to avoid detection. The Green River Task Force, despite its unprecedented size and resources, struggled against both the killer's cunning and systemic prejudices that devalued his victims. Early in the investigation, some officials suggested that the murders might actually benefit society by removing prostitutes and drug addicts from the streets. This attitude, while not officially endorsed, reflected broader social views that complicated the investigation. Resources that might have been deployed immediately for victims from different backgrounds were delayed or reduced. Ridgway's ability to pass a polygraph test in 1982 reveals another systemic failure. Polygraph technology, while not admissible in court, was still widely used by law enforcement as an investigative tool. Ridgway's success in defeating this test wasn't due to technological failure, but to his psychological makeup. Psychopaths often show reduced emotional responses to deception, making them naturally resistant to polygraph detection. His calm demeanor during questioning, which should have been suspicious, was instead interpreted as evidence of innocence. The Atlanta Ripper case represents perhaps the most egregious example of how social prejudice can completely derail justice. Operating during the height of Jim Crow segregation, this unknown killer murdered black women with complete impunity, protected by a system that barely acknowledged their humanity, let alone their right to justice. The investigation was hampered not just by limited forensic technology, but by active indifference from white authorities who viewed the victims as expendable. The killer's timing was particularly sinister. Saturday night murders, followed by Sunday morning discoveries, created a weekly cycle of terror in Atlanta's black community. This pattern suggests someone who understood the social dynamics of the city, who knew that weekend deaths would be attributed to the chaos of Saturday night rather than systematic predation. The killer was actively exploiting racial stereotypes about black communities, using prejudice as camouflage for serial murder. The brutality of the crimes escalated systematically, from simple throat cutting to elaborate mutilation and organ removal. This progression indicates either a single killer becoming increasingly confident and sadistic, or multiple killers competing to create more horrific displays. The removal of victims' shoes and hearts suggests ritualistic elements that were never properly investigated due to the inadequate police response. Local authorities' failure to solve these cases wasn't just investigative incompetence, it was willful neglect. Black women's lives were considered so worthless that their murders didn't warrant serious attention. When suspects were arrested, investigations were perfunctory, designed more to calm public fears than to achieve actual justice. The 6 men arrested in connection with the crimes were processed through a legal system that was more interested in closing cases than solving them. Alfred Gainor's crimes reveal how addiction and desperation create hunting grounds for predators. His victims were women struggling with drug addiction, poverty, and social isolation, vulnerabilities that he exploited with practiced efficiency. Gainor didn't just kill these women, he destroyed entire families, often staging crime scenes so that victims' own children would discover their mother's bodies. His method combined sexual sadism with psychological terrorism. The positioning of victims' bodies wasn't just about evading detection, it was about maximizing trauma for whoever found them. When children discovered their mother's corpses, arranged in grotesque poses, Gaynor was extending his violence beyond the immediate victims to destroy entire family structures. This calculated cruelty reveals a killer who understood that murder was just the beginning of the suffering he could inflict. The drug connection provided Gaynor with both opportunity and camouflage. His victims would willingly accompany him to isolated locations, trusting him as a fellow addict rather than recognizing him as a predator. The drug trade's inherent secrecy meant that these meetings occurred without witnesses, in locations chosen for their isolation from law enforcement. Gaynor exploited the underground economy of addiction, using its hidden networks to find victims and dispose of evidence. His confession regarding his nephew's wrongful conviction reveals the complex web of manipulation that surrounded his crimes. Paul Fickling spent years in prison for a murder his uncle committed, an injustice that Gaynor allowed to continue until it served his purposes to reveal the truth. This delay suggests that Gaynor's confession wasn't motivated by conscience, but by strategic calculation, using his nephew's suffering as a bargaining chip in plea negotiations. These 5 killers succeeded not despite our institutions, but because of them. They turned hospitals into hideouts, nursing homes into slaughterhouses, highways into hunting grounds. They exploited prejudice, manipulated compassion, and weaponized society's own systems of care and protection. Their victims weren't just individuals, they were representatives of our collective failure to protect the most vulnerable among us. The true horror isn't in the brutality of their crimes, but in how easily they committed them, how long they continued, and how many people looked the other way. What makes these 5 killers particularly chilling isn't just the horrific nature of their crimes, but how their stories expose the catastrophic failures that allowed them to operate for so long. Each case reveals a different weakness in our society's protective systems, creating perfect storms where predators could hunt with impunity. Charles Ray Hatcher represents perhaps the most maddening example of systemic failure. For decades, he manipulated the mental health and criminal justice systems like a master chess player, using feigned insanity as his get-out-of-jail-free card. Born in 1929 in Mound City, Missouri, Hatcher learned early that acting crazy could get him out of trouble. What started as childhood manipulation evolved into a sophisticated survival strategy that would enable him to kill 16 people across multiple states. Hatcher's method was diabolically simple. Whenever he was arrested for serious crimes, he would suddenly develop dramatic psychiatric symptoms, convincing doctors and judges that he was too mentally ill to stand trial. He would be committed to psychiatric facilities where he'd behave as a model patient until he could secure release or transfer. Then he'd disappear, only to surface months or years later with new victims. This cycle repeated itself dozens of times over 3 decades. The tragic irony is that Hatcher was actually quite intelligent and calculating. Former FBI profiler John Douglas, who interviewed him extensively, described Hatcher as one of the most manipulative criminals he'd ever encountered. Hatcher could discuss his crimes with chilling clarity, explaining exactly how he'd fooled psychiatrists and exploited legal loopholes. He targeted vulnerable children because he knew they made easy victims and unreliable witnesses. When 11-year-old Michelle Steele's body was found on a Missouri riverbank in 1982, bearing signs of brutal beating and strangulation, investigators finally had the evidence they needed to hold Hatcher accountable. But even then, the system nearly failed. Hatcher's defense team immediately moved for another insanity plea, and he began his familiar routine of bizarre behavior and claimed memory loss. This time, however, investigators had learned from past mistakes. They documented every inconsistency in his story, every moment when his supposed mental illness conveniently disappeared. When confronted with overwhelming evidence, Hatcher finally confessed to 16 murders spanning from 1969 to 1982, providing details that only the killer could know. The most disturbing aspect of Hatcher's case isn't just that he killed 16 people, but that he could have been stopped after his first murder if the systems designed to protect society had been properly coordinated. His psychiatric records, criminal history, and behavioral patterns created a clear picture of an extremely dangerous individual, but jurisdictional boundaries and inadequate information sharing allowed him to slip through the cracks repeatedly. Amy Archer Gilligan operated in an entirely different sphere, but exploited similar systemic weaknesses. Born Amy Dugan in 1873, she discovered that elderly care provided the perfect cover for systematic murder. Her nursing home in Windsor, Connecticut, became what newspapers would later call a murder factory, where 48 people died under suspicious circumstances between 1907 and 1917. Archer Gilligan's genius lay in understanding that society didn't pay close attention to elderly deaths. When elderly people died in nursing homes, it was expected, even if the timing seemed convenient for the facility's finances. She perfected a routine where new residents would pay substantial upfront fees for long-term care, then die within weeks or months, often after changing their wills to benefit her or taking out life insurance policies with her as beneficiary. Her weapon of choice was poison, typically arsenic or strychnine, administered in food or medicine. She would often serve her victims lemonade spiked with lethal doses, then express appropriate grief when they died suddenly. The local doctor, who was either incompetent or complicit, rarely questioned the deaths, usually attributing them to natural causes or existing health conditions. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for Nellie Pierce, whose brother Franklin Andrews died just 1 month after moving into the Archer home. Pierce noticed that her brother had been healthy and optimistic about his future when he entered the facility, making his sudden death highly suspicious. When she investigated further, she discovered that her brother had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy with Archer Gilligan as the beneficiary. Pierce's persistent inquiries were initially dismissed by local authorities, who saw her as a grieving sister unable to accept natural death. But Pierce refused to give up, eventually contacting the Hartford Courant newspaper. The resulting investigation revealed a horrifying pattern of deaths that coincided perfectly with insurance policies and inheritance arrangements. When authorities finally exhumed bodies from the facility's cemetery, they found lethal levels of arsenic and strychnine in victim after victim. Archer Gilligan's case exposed how society's trust in caregivers could be weaponized by predators. The very people we entrust with our most vulnerable loved ones sometimes view that vulnerability as opportunity. Her story inspired the classic play Arsenic and Old Lace, but the real-life version was far more calculating and profit-driven than the fictional portrayal suggested. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, exploited different weaknesses in society's protective systems. Operating in the Seattle area from 1982 to 1998, Ridgway understood that certain victims wouldn't be prioritized by law enforcement or missed quickly by society. He specifically targeted sex workers, runaways, and other marginalized women, knowing that their disappearances might not trigger immediate intensive investigations. Our Ridgway's method was devastatingly effective in its simplicity. He would cruise areas known for prostitution, offering women rides or proposing transactions. Once they were in his vehicle, he would drive to secluded areas where he would strangle them, often during or immediately after sexual assault. He then disposed of their bodies in remote locations, frequently returning to the dump sites to commit further acts of necrophilia. What made Ridgway particularly dangerous was his ability to appear completely normal. He worked steady jobs, maintained relationships, and lived in the same community for decades. Neighbors described him as quiet and unremarkable. He was even married multiple times, with wives later expressing shock at learning about his crimes. This facade of normalcy allowed him to operate without suspicion while accumulating what would become the highest confirmed victim count of any serial killer in United States history. The investigation into the Green River killings became one of the longest and most expensive in American history, but Ridgway's careful victim selection and disposal methods made him extremely difficult to catch. Many of his victims weren't reported missing for weeks or months, giving him time to destroy evidence and establish alibis. When bodies were discovered, they were often so decomposed that determining cause of death was challenging. Ridgway was actually questioned early in the investigation and even passed a polygraph test, leading investigators to eliminate him as a suspect. It wasn't until DNA technology advanced sufficiently that preserved evidence from the 1980s could definitively link him to his victims. When he was finally arrested in 2001, he confessed to 49 murders, though he claimed the actual number was higher and that he had lost count of his victims. The Atlanta Ripper case represents perhaps the most tragic example of how societal prejudices can enable serial killers. Operating primarily between 1911 and 1915, this unidentified killer targeted black women in Atlanta, understanding that their murders wouldn't receive the same investigative attention as crimes against white victims. The killer's method was brutally efficient. Most attacks occurred on Saturday nights, with bodies discovered Sunday mornings. Victims were typically found with their throats slashed and bodies mutilated, often with shoes removed and taken as trophies. The violence was excessive, clearly intended to terrorize the community and demonstrate the killer's complete power over his victims. What makes the Atlanta Ripper case particularly infuriating is how little effort was made to solve it. Despite a clear pattern of murders occurring in the same area with similar methods, police investigations were perfunctory at best. The victims were dismissed as prostitutes or women of questionable character, implying they somehow deserved their fate. Newspaper coverage was minimal, and there was no public outcry demanding justice. The killer understood exactly how to exploit the racial dynamics of early 20th century Atlanta. By targeting black women, particularly those involved in sex work, he knew he could operate with minimal risk of serious investigation. The few arrests made in connection with the crimes were largely for show, with suspects released quickly due to lack of evidence or interest in building strong cases. This calculated exploitation of racial prejudice allowed the Atlanta Ripper to kill with impunity for years. The exact number of victims remains unknown, with estimates ranging from 6 to over 20 deaths. The case was never officially solved, leaving families without closure and a community terrorized by both the killer and the system that failed to protect them. Alfred Gainor's story completes our examination of how serial killers exploit societal weaknesses. Operating in Springfield, Massachusetts between 1995 and 1998, Gainor targeted women struggling with addiction, understanding that their lifestyle made them vulnerable and their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate investigation. Gainor himself was deeply addicted to crack cocaine, which brought him into contact with his victims through the drug trade. He would encounter women during drug transactions or while seeking drugs in known areas of activity. His addiction provided both the motivation for his crimes, as he often robbed victims to fund his habit, and the cover for his hunting behavior. His method was particularly cruel. After gaining access to victims' homes, often through shared drug connections, he would assault, rape, and murder them, then pose their bodies in shocking positions intended to traumatize whoever discovered them. In several cases, it was the victim's own children who found their mother's bodies, adding another layer of horror to his crimes. Gainor's case reveals how addiction creates networks of vulnerable people who exist largely outside society's protective systems. His victims were often estranged from family members, involved in dangerous activities to fund their addictions, and living in unstable situations that made them easy targets. When they disappeared, there might be no one to report them missing or demand investigation. The investigation into Gainor's crimes was complicated by the chaotic lifestyle of both the perpetrator and victims. Traditional investigative methods were less effective when dealing with a population that moved frequently, used false names, and avoided contact with authorities. It took years to connect the various murders and identify patterns in what initially appeared to be random violence in a community plagued by drug-related crime. When Gainor was finally caught in 1998, he was convicted of 4 murders, but suspected in several others. In a bizarre twist, he later confessed to additional murders, including one for which his own nephew had been wrongly convicted. This confession led to his nephew's release, but also revealed the extent to which Gainor had been willing to let an innocent family member suffer to protect himself. These 5 cases share disturbing common threads that reveal fundamental flaws in how society protects its most vulnerable members. Each killer succeeded by identifying and exploiting specific weaknesses in our protective systems, whether through manipulating mental health procedures, exploiting trust in caregivers, targeting marginalized populations, benefiting from racial prejudice, or operating within communities devastated by addiction. The victims in each case were chosen specifically because they were unlikely to be missed quickly or have their disappearances taken seriously. Children in Hatcher's case were vulnerable and made unreliable witnesses. Elderly residents in Archer Gilligan's facility were expected to die. Sex workers and runaways targeted by Ridgway were dismissed as living dangerous lifestyles. Black women killed by the Atlanta Ripper were devalued by racist society. The stories of these 5 serial killers reveal a disturbing pattern that extends far beyond individual pathology. Each case exposes critical failures in our society's ability to protect its most vulnerable members, creating environments where predators could operate with devastating effectiveness. Charles Ray Hatcher's decades-long killing spree demonstrates how a broken mental health system can become a killer's greatest ally. Time and again, Hatcher manipulated psychiatric evaluations, feigned mental illness, and exploited jurisdictional confusion to escape justice. He understood that claiming insanity would buy him time, that moving between states would scatter evidence, and that targeting society's forgotten would minimize scrutiny. His ability to game the system for over 30 years represents a catastrophic failure of institutional oversight and communication between agencies. Amy Archer Gilligan's reign of terror in her nursing home reveals how trust and authority can become weapons of mass destruction. She didn't just kill for money, she systematically exploited the very relationships designed to protect the elderly. Families trusted her with their most vulnerable loved ones. Insurance companies approved her policies without adequate oversight, and medical professionals failed to recognize obvious patterns of suspicious deaths. Her case shows how institutional corruption and willful blindness can enable predators to operate in plain sight. Gary Ridgway's 2-decade killing spree as the Green River Killer exposes society's indifference toward marginalized women. He specifically targeted sex workers, runaways, and addicted women because he knew their disappearances would generate minimal investigation. Law enforcement resources were limited, public concern was muted, and media coverage was sporadic. Ridgway understood that society had essentially written off his victims before he ever killed them, giving him the invisibility he needed to become America's most prolific serial killer. The Atlanta Ripper case represents perhaps the most damning indictment of systemic failure. In early 20th century Atlanta, black women were so devalued by society that a serial killer could butcher dozens of them with virtual impunity. The investigation was hampered not just by limited forensic technology, but by institutional racism that deemed these victims unworthy of serious attention. The killer understood that racial prejudice would shield him from justice, and he was tragically correct. Alfred Gainor's crimes in Springfield demonstrate how addiction, poverty, and social chaos can create perfect hunting grounds for predators. His victims were caught in cycles of addiction and desperation that made them vulnerable to exploitation. The investigation was complicated by the chaotic nature of street-level drug culture, where witnesses were unreliable, victims had complicated histories, and traditional investigative methods struggled to penetrate the social disorder. These cases share common threads that reveal uncomfortable truths about our society. Each killer exploited specific systemic weaknesses, targeting victims who were already failed by institutions meant to protect them: the elderly in substandard care facilities, the mentally ill in overwhelmed systems, marginalized women ignored by law enforcement, racial minorities dismissed by white society, and the addicted abandoned by social services. The killers themselves represent different faces of evil, but their success depended on the same fundamental failures. Inadequate communication between agencies allowed Hatcher to slip through cracks for decades. Insufficient oversight of care facilities enabled Archer Gilligan to poison dozens. Social prejudice gave the Atlanta Ripper virtual immunity. Indifference toward marginalized women provided Ridgway with perfect victims. And societal neglect of addiction and poverty created ideal conditions for Gainor's predation. Perhaps most disturbing is how these killers understood and exploited these systemic failures better than the systems themselves. They possessed an intuitive grasp of where society was weakest, where oversight was lacking, where prejudice created blind spots, and where institutional failures left victims unprotected. They didn't just kill individuals, they weaponized societal dysfunction. The true horror of these cases lies not just in the body counts, but in how preventable many of these deaths were. Better communication between mental health facilities could have stopped Hatcher. Proper oversight of nursing homes could have saved Archer Gilligan's victims. Adequate investigation of missing marginalized women could have caught Ridgway earlier. Equal treatment under the law could have stopped the Atlanta Ripper. And comprehensive addiction treatment and poverty reduction could have protected Gainor's victims. These serial killers succeeded because they understood something that society often refuses to acknowledge. Some lives are valued less than others. They exploited this cruel hierarchy, knowing that certain victims would generate minimal investigation, that certain institutions would provide inadequate oversight, and that certain prejudices would shield them from scrutiny. The legacy of these cases should be a commitment to protecting society's most vulnerable members. Real reform requires acknowledging that serial killers don't create systemic failures, they exploit existing ones. Until we address the underlying prejudices, institutional weaknesses, and social neglect that enable predators, we remain vulnerable to the next monster who understands how to weaponize our failures against our most defenseless citizens. These 5 killers may be dead or imprisoned, but the systems that enabled them largely remain unchanged. Their stories serve as a warning that evil often succeeds not through supernatural cunning, but through exploitation of very human failures in compassion, justice, and institutional responsibility. The question isn't whether there will be more predators like them, but whether we'll finally address the systemic failures that make their crimes possible.